I still remember the sound the river made that night, like it was chewing on something. It should never have been given, and I remember how the moonlight hit that red cloth just right, so I could see what was inside. And I remember realizing in one ugly heartbeat that a famous rich man from our town was trying to make his biggest mistake disappear where no one would ever know, except I was right there watching. Back then, I was the kind of kid people stepped around without really seeing, a skinny 13-year-old with patched-up clothes and no real address, sleeping in an old shed near the tracks or under the bridge if the weather let me, doing odd jobs for spare change, sweeping porches, hauling trash, anything that traded sweat for a sandwich. And yeah, most days I felt like background noise in everyone else's life, you know what I mean? The man at the river that night was the opposite of me in every possible way. Clean shoes, sharp suit car that purred more than it drove, his name stamped on donation plaques all over town. Martin Cole, the guy they pointed to when they wanted to talk about success and respectability, and all those words that sound nice on paper but feel a lot colder up close. I knew his face from a distance from sweeping outside his restaurant and pretending not to listen when he talked about charity and legacy like he was some kind of hero. But that night, there were no cameras, no handshakes, just him and that basket wrapped in red cloth, the one that twitched in his hands as he walked down to the water. At first, I thought it might be a dog or something. People dump animals by the river all the time when they get tired of feeding them, and it still makes me sick to say that, like it's normal. But then the wind shifted, and I heard it. Not a bark, not a whine. Two thin, sharp cries, one right after the other. The sound a brand new human makes when the world hits too hard and too fast. My stomach dropped, my whole body went cold, colder than the night air on my bare feet, and I pressed myself closer to the shadow of the bridge, watching him set that basket on the muddy bank, like he was putting down a heavy suitcase instead of two living, breathing babies. He pulled the cloth back, and I saw them. Twins, tiny faces scrunched and red from crying. Little hands clawing at the air like they were trying to grab onto something they couldn't see, and their skin. Their skin was darker than his by a mile. Not something you could overlook or explain away. And right then, without anyone spelling it out, I understood exactly why a man like Martin would walk all the way out here alone, hugging his secret close. He was talking under his breath, not really to them, more to himself, and I could hear pieces of it drifting over the water. Things like, "No one will understand," and "This will ruin everything," and "Better they don't grow up knowing what they are." And the more he talked, the more it sounded like he was trying to convince himself that this was mercy instead of what it really was. I watched his hands shake as he bent down, and I kept waiting for the moment he'd snap out of it, pick the basket back up, call someone, do anything. But what he finally did, which was lower those babies into the black water and push the basket out just far enough that the current could grab it. Something in me snapped louder than the wood of that old bridge ever had. And before my brain caught up with my feet, I was sliding down the bank, rocks tearing at my ankles, yelling, "Hey, what are you doing?" My voice bounced off the water and the trees, and Martin spun around, his whole body flinching like he'd been shot, fear wide in his eyes for half a second before he recognized me, the kid who swept his stoop. And just like that, the fear flipped into something colder, like he'd remembered I was nobody, and that made it easier to be cruel. "This doesn't concern you," he said, teeth clenched, voice low, the kind of tone rich men use when they want a problem to go away quietly, turn around, and go home. I could feel the river licking at my toes, but I shook my head, staring past him at the basket, bobbing farther out, the cries getting thinner. "I don't have a home," I told him, "and they sure as hell aren't yours to throw away." His jaw worked like he was chewing on the right words. Then he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne fighting with the sour smell of fear. You didn't see anything, boy, he hissed. You walk away right now and this never happened, you hear me? I looked from him to the twins and back, those tiny faces disappearing a little more with each second. And something inside me rose up that was bigger than hunger or cold or the years of people walking past me like I was trash. And I said, they're your kids. You can't just get rid of them because they don't look how you wanted. His eyes flashed, and for the first time I saw how much hate a man could pour into a single stare. You think the world is kind to children like that with a father like me? He snapped. My name, my money, my face. You think people will let that go? You think they'll let my wife forget my clients, forget my investors, forget they'll tear my life apart, and they'll use those children to do it. They'll call them mistakes and corruption and sin. They'll drag everything I built through the mud, and you want to lecture me about kindness? I laughed once, short and ugly, because it was that or screamed down where I live. I said people start with nothing. Every single day, they lose jobs and houses and names, and nobody writes about it, nobody cares, and we don't go around killing babies to protect some fancy last name. His voice dropped almost to a whisper, and that was somehow worse than the yelling. You have no idea what you're playing with, he said. This is bigger than you, bigger than them. There are stories about children like this, stories about marks and fate and men who lose everything when the wrong truth comes out. I am fixing this before it explodes. Behind him, the basket floated a little farther, red cloth glowing faintly in the moonlight, like a warning light on the edge of the world. And I realized that if I didn't move right, then if I kept arguing, I'd watch them disappear. So I stepped past him into the water. The cold punched the breath out of my lungs and made my muscles seize, but that sound, those thin, desperate cries, pulled me forward step by step until the river picked my feet off the ground and I was swimming, arms burning, as my clothes dragged against the current like they were trying to hold me back. The basket bobbed and twisted, every tiny wave spinning it away from my reaching fingers. And I kept muttering, hang on, I'm coming, more for myself than for them, because they were too small to understand anything but fear. My fingers brushed the wicker, once slid off the current, yanking it harder toward the middle, and for a second I thought I was going to watch it disappear under the surface. And that would be the image burned into my brain for the rest of my life, but something shifted under the water. A swirl, a push, and suddenly it drifted just close enough that when I lunged again, my hand clamped down on the handle. It almost ripped my arm out of its socket, but I didn't let go, and then, not after everything, I pulled that basket against my chest and turned back toward shore, kicking and fighting the river like it was a living thing that wanted to keep what it had been given. By the time my knees scraped mud, I was shaking so hard I could barely drag myself out. But I did, collapsing on the bank with the basket still crushed against me, like it was the last piece of the world that made sense. I peeled the cloth back just enough to see two tiny faces, still scrunched, and wet eyes squeezed shut, mouths wide open, as they screamed at the night for what it had done to them. And I started laughing and crying at the same time, this weird broken sound I couldn't control because against all odds they were alive. Then I heard footsteps behind me and a voice that made my spine go rigid. "You stupid kid," Martin said, his voice shaking, not with guilt or regret, but with rage, the kind of rage rich men feel when the people they think are beneath them refuse to cooperate. I turned, still kneeling in the mud, and saw his perfect suit splattered his shoes, ruined his hair a mess for probably the first time in years, and all of that seemed to offend him almost as much as the fact that I was still breathing. "You had one job in this world," he said, teeth clenched, eyes locked on mine. "Stay invisible, and you couldn't even do that right." I wiped water from my face and nodded toward the basket. "I saved them," I said, voice raw. That's not something I'm ever going to apologize for." He stared at the twins, jaw working something calculating, moving behind his eyes, and then he said the quiet part out loud. "Those children are a stain I cannot afford. Do you understand me now? Do you have any idea what happens if people see them and start asking where they came from, what they are, what I did? There are old stories, old marks, old curses tied to children like that. And I will not let my entire life get dragged down by superstition and gossip and that." He practically spit the word, like their skin, their existence offended him on every level. "Maybe what they'll really see," I said, voice shaking, but not backing down, "is what kind of man throws his own kids into a river, and maybe the only curse here is how much you care about what they think instead of who they are." For the first time that night, he looked scared of me, not because I was strong, but because I wasn't playing my assigned role anymore. I wasn't the quiet, grateful kid who kept his head down and swept the floors. I was the witness. He didn't plan for the one thing he couldn't buy. Then the fear flipped again into rage, and he lunged, reaching for the basket for me, for anything he could grab and control, and I did the one thing I knew how to do better than most people in that town. I ran. I grabbed the basket and bolted into the trees, roots and branches lashing at my legs, twigs breaking under my bare feet, his footsteps pounding right behind me, his voice slicing through the dark. "Get back here, Patches. You think anyone is going to believe you over me. You think your word means anything against mine." I didn't waste breath answering. I just ran, heart slamming against my ribs, twins wailing against my chest, every step screaming that I was in way over my head, and it was already too late to turn back. The trees finally broke open into a clearing, and ahead of me I saw the old wooden bridge that led straight into town, the same one I'd slept under and on and beside for years, the one everyone said was going to fall into the river one day and take whoever was on it down too, and I remember thinking, well, I guess today's the day we find out who that is. I hit the first plank and felt the whole thing shudder, wood groaning nails complaining, water roaring underneath like it was laughing, and I ran anyway, because what else was there to do, stop and hand those kids back to the man who just tried to drown them. Behind me I heard Martin hit the bridge, his heavier weight shaking it twice as hard. "You're going to kill us both," he yelled, voice fraying. "Think, boy, think who you're crossing." "Pretty sure I figured that out already," I shouted back without slowing down. Halfway across, I heard the sound I'd been dreading since the first step. A crack clean and sharp like a bone snapping, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth. And the bridge dipped behind me, boards dropping a few inches as something gave way. I tightened my grip on the basket, my knuckles white around the handle, and sprinted every step, bringing a new chorus of groans from the wood. Another nail, giving up another warning. I chose to ignore, because what was chasing me was worse than what was underneath. Another crack, louder, the whole structure tilting. And then I felt, rather than saw, what happened next. The section behind me dropped out completely. Martin's shout turned from rage to pure panic as his foot hit nothing, and gravity remembered his name, his hand grabbing for a rail that came away in his fingers, his eyes wide as mine for just a second, before the river swallowed him like it had tried to swallow his kids. I reached the far side and almost fell on my face, my legs shaking so hard they barely worked, and I turned just in time to see the last of his expensive suit disappear under the black water. No slow motion, no dramatic speech, just gone like the river had decided whose life it was keeping and whose it was returning. I stood there gasping, clutching the basket so tight I was afraid I'd crush it, and it hit me that something huge had just happened, something no one was going to believe. Something that would be argued about for years once the truth finally crawled out of the dark, but for the moment, there was no time to process any of that, because the twins were still crying, and they needed a place that wasn't a collapsing bridge or a muddy riverbank. By the time I stumbled into town, soaked and shaking and tired in a way that went deeper than muscles, lanterns were glowing in windows and on porches. And for once, people didn't look through me when I appeared at the edge of the street. They stared, really stared at the dirty kid with the red basket and the two screaming, brown-skinned babies inside. A woman came forward first, hands trembling, her eyes bouncing between my face and the basket. "Where did you get them?" she asked, voice already carrying more fear than curiosity. "In the river," I said, throat raw. "Their father threw them in." You could hear the whole crowd inhale at once, all those years of rumor and whispering about Martin's late nights and quiet meetings finally crashing into something they could see and touch. And suddenly, the man they worshipped in daylight looked a lot more human in the dark than Mr. Rowan, the town elder, pushed his way to the front, a man who'd seen every kind of trouble in this place, and usually met it with calm and a tired smile, but when he knelt and pulled the cloth back and really looked at those twins, the color drained right out of his face. On each little chest, just below the collarbone, was the same strange mark, curved lines crossing in a way that almost looked like a symbol, something you might see carved into an old door or scratched into the back of a church pew, something older than all of us put together. Rowan whispered a name I didn't recognize, some old word that made the hair on my arms stand up, and the reaction was instant. People stepped back as if the babies had teeth. Someone muttered about curses, someone else hissed that we should get them out of town before they came looking, even though nobody said who they were. I looked around, confused and angry and still out of breath. "They're just babies," I said louder than I meant to. "Their father tried to kill them, because he's scared of how they look and what people will say. And now you're scared too. What are you all so afraid of?" Rowan got to his feet slowly, his knees popping, and put a hand on my shoulder, gentle but shaking. "Martin came to me weeks ago," he said, eyes on the twins instead of me. "Asked about marks like these, asked if the old stories could be true. And I told him stories are just that. Stories, but he didn't want to hear that part. He only heard the pieces that scared him." He looked me in the eye then, and I could see how tired he was. "The stories say children born like this grow up to drag hidden things into the light, to tear apart lies powerful men have built their lives on, to change who gets to hold power and who doesn't. And men like Martin don't fear gods or curses. They fear losing control. So he decided to kill them before they could embarrass him," I said, my voice flat, my anger settling into something heavier, before they could grow up and prove he wasn't the perfect man on the billboard. Rowan opened his mouth to answer, but another sound cut through the murmurs. Distant engines, more than one coming up the road, headlights slicing through the dark, the kind of sound that means trouble is arriving in a hurry. People looked at each other, at the babies, at me, and I could feel the town starting to split right down the middle between help them and hide them and throw them back where you found them. Fear dragging everyone into their corners before a single official car had even parked. Rowan moved fast for an old man, then grabbing a dusty backpack from a hook and stuffing it with whatever he could reach. A loaf of bread, a bottle of water, a blanket, a rusted flashlight. And then he shoved it into my chest along with the basket, like he'd already decided something without asking me. "You need to go," he said. "Why me?" I asked, my voice cracking. "I'm nobody. I'm the kid who sleeps under bridges and sweeps your steps. You got families here, good people, people with houses and locks and money. Give them the babies, they'll do better than me." "Exactly," Rowan said, his grip firm on my shoulder. "Everyone knows them, watches them, counts their kids at the dinner table. They have things that can be threatened and taken away, jobs that can be lost, mortgages that can fall apart. You You slip through the cracks. You move like smoke through this town. Nobody keeps track of where you sleep or who you talk to, and that makes you the only one who can walk out of here with those twins and not bring a storm down on every person you pass. I looked down at their faces, finally quiet, after all the crying, their little hands tangled together, like even they knew they were in this mess as a set. And I thought about the river and the bridge and the look in Martin's eyes when he realized gravity didn't care about how much money he had. And it hit me that I was standing at my own edge now, about to step into something that would shape the rest of my life whether I wanted it or not. Where would I even take them? I asked, because giving them back wasn't an option anymore, not after everything. Rowan nodded toward the dark line of hills beyond the last house. Up, he said. There's an old logging road behind this building. Nobody uses it. It'll get you into the woods where cars can't follow after that. You keep moving until you find a place that doesn't ask whose children they are, before deciding whether they deserve to live. He opened the back door, and the cold slapped me in the face along with the glow of those distant headlights bouncing off buildings getting closer. And he added quietly, "People are going to argue about what happened here for years, Patches. They're going to stand in kitchens and churches and bars and talk about whether Martin was a monster or a coward or just a man crushed under the weight of his own lies. They're going to talk about those marks and that prophecy and color and shame and reputation, but none of that noise will ever change one thing. When those babies were dropped into the river, you were the only one who jumped in." That line followed me out the door into the dark, onto that hidden path that led toward the hills, and it might as well have been nailed to my back, along with every name I'd ever been called. I walked at first, then ran when the engines got louder, and the shouts started the twins warm against my chest, their breaths small and steady, and I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't just trying to survive the day I was responsible for someone else's whole future, maybe even the future of people I'd never meet, if those old stories had even a grain of truth in them. So that's my story, or at least the part of it that started with a red basket on a black river, and now I want to ask you something since you're watching this from the comfort of your room, or your car, or wherever you are. When you see someone treated like they don't belong because of their skin, or their story, or how they were born, do you look away and tell yourself it isn't your business? Or do you step in even when it's messy and risky, and nobody's promised you'll come out looking good on the other side, you know what I mean? What do you think about Martin? Was he pure evil, a coward trapped by his own fear and prejudice, or just another broken human being who chose the worst possible way out of a problem he helped create? And what about those twins? Do you believe they deserved a chance at life no matter what? Some old prophecy or mark said about them? Or do you think some lives come with too much baggage to be worth saving? I really want to hear your thoughts, your anger, your mercy, your stories. Have you ever seen someone get written off as less than human and had to decide whether to stay silent or to speak up? Have you ever been the one in the water, dragged down by someone else's shame? Drop a comment, argue with me, argue with each other. Talk about prejudice, reputation. What real courage looks like when nobody's filming it. Because in the end, the real question here isn't just what a rich man did by that river in the dark. It's what you would have done if you'd been standing where I was, with the cold at your feet, and two tiny voices begging you not to look away.